couple questions that my listeners wanted to know was, what do you think Mary, Queen of Scots' level of involvement in Darnley's murder was? And also the Casket Letters, do you think they're forgeries? Talk a little about your opinion about that.
I think it's obvious that they're forgeries. We know they're forgeries. I mean, there's so much internal evidence that shows that they are forgeries. We've got to remember that about 75% of the evidence about Mary, Queen of Scots comes from her enemies,
right? Who
were on a mission and had a great justification to save their own necks for portraying her as an adulteress and murderess. Her relations with Bothwell up to we can discount the Casket Letters because I think they're just no good, no use as evidence because there's so many errors in them and so many misconceptions, and some of them don't even relate to Bothwell. They relate to Mary's son James. But if we discount those, there is no evidence, absolutely no evidence before Darnley's murder to link Mary romantically to Bothwell. Mm-hmm. In fact, I mean, a lot of people say, well, she must have known because there were at least two groups of conspirators at Kirkhofield on the night that Darnley was murdered. So I have to say it's a cast of thousands in the suspect. It's most of the Scottish nobility who are involved in this. But hello, she didn't. No, not necessarily. She didn't. She might not have known. She could well not have known because a few months earlier, Rizzio, her secretary, had been brutally murdered almost in her presence, and most of the Scottish lords were involved in that, and she didn't know about it. It came as an absolute shock. She was in a state of physical and mental collapse. There's plenty of evidence for that after Darnley's murder. She'd been through a hell of a lot in her reign. She'd been very ill the previous October, and even her contemporaries were saying it was due to stress. She'd vomited 60 times in one day.
She went into a very bad situation.
She did go into a very bad situation. The problem was, because of her physical and mental state, she suffered inertia. She didn't do anything. She kept saying she would do something to bring Darnley's murderers to justice. But the whole point was that, I mean, there were rumours that it was Bothwell, and Bothwell was certainly there at Kirkhofield, but it wasn't Bothwell who killed Darnley, but people thought he did. And, of course, he intended to. He was the one who laid the explosion and had the house undermined. We know that. There's plenty of evidence about that. No, it was people far closer to the centre of government. It was actually Darnley's own kinsmen, the Douglases, who murdered him. So Mary could not have been involved in that. She shouldn't have been involved with that. But I mean, I think there was a sop to her conscience because the previous December, 2 months before, she'd been at a conference at Craigmillar Castle, and the Scottish lords had they discussed with her what to do with Darnley. And in the end, they just said, well, don't worry. They said it'll all be dealt with and you won't have to worry, sort of thing. And she said, well, nothing must be done against my queenly honour or my conscience. I haven't used her words exactly, but that's what she said. And I think that was a sop to her conscience because I think it must have been obvious. They realised divorce wasn't an option. How else could they get rid of this man who was plotting against her and being a total general nuisance and very vicious to her as well? To be honest, I think if I'd been married to Darnley, I'd have killed him.
Right. Yeah.
But afterwards with Bothwell, Bothwell suddenly comes into his own. He's one of these men, I'm thinking, who power corrupts, and we see that very quickly. Beforehand, you see him as quite an upright man. He'd been the only one of the Scottish lords who'd not taken bribes from the English. And he comes into his own, and he treats her virtually as his prisoner. He kidnaps her, carries her off to the big stronghold at Dunbar. Some said it was with her consent, and when she tried to send out, she didn't seem to do very much to try and escape, and people said it was with her collusion. But the whole point was, when he came back to Edinburgh with her, and leading her horse by the bridle, which is a symbol of captivity, she married him. She was very, very unhappy. She was crying a lot. It looks as if he forced her into a situation that she couldn't get out of. He'd asked to marry her before. He'd even got the lords to sign a bond supporting it, and she'd refused. I think he forced her.
Yeah.
I mean, you're innocent until you're proved guilty. There isn't the evidence to prove Mary, Queen of Scots, guilty. Circumstantially, you can make a case. You can make a case for all sorts of things, but there just isn't the evidence.
Mm-hmm.